I'd like to turn to the book of Job, chapter 32, and also the 19th Psalm. Job 32, Psalm 19. Read verse 7 in Job 32. I said, days should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. Psalm 19, verse 2. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. What we have here are the words of Elihu and David. To establish the context of these verses, we'll begin with just a little bit of background. In Job 32, we have the words of Elihu. As we all know, following the tragic events of Job's life, Job sits in the ashes and he's grieving. And three of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, come to mourn, chapter 2, verse 11, come to mourn with him and to comfort him. In chapter 2 and verse 12, we see they sat with him upon the ground for 7 days and 7 nights, and none spoke a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. So for 7 days and 7 nights, they sit in silence. In chapter 3, Job breaks the silence. He speaks, which would be the beginning of a discourse between him and his friends. In chapters 4 through 31, we have the record of the conversation between Job and Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. The gist of the conversation was this. They would accuse Job of sin in his life, and then Job would defend himself, proclaiming his innocence. In Job 32, in verse 1, notice the point that they had come to. So these three men ceased to answer Job, because he was righteous in his own eyes. So as the discourse was going on between Job and Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar, there's another man there by the name of Elihu. And he sat and listened. And he became disgusted with Job. Notice verse 2 of Job 32. Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu. And then notice the latter part. Against Job was his wrath kindled, because he justified himself rather than God. He also became disgusted with the other three. Verse 3, also against his three friends was his wrath kindled, because they had found no answer, and yet had condemned Job. So Elihu sat silent through it all. When Job was done speaking, chapters 26 through 31, and there was no answer from the others, Elihu speaks. Notice verse 6 of Job 32. And Elihu, the son of Berachel, the Buzite, answered and said, they had stopped, again, these three had stopped speaking, verse 1. I am young, and ye are very old. Wherefore I was afraid, and durst not show you my opinion. He goes on in our text and said, I said days should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. So here's what he said. I've been quiet. I have sat here in quietness because Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar have had many days. So I figured, since they've had many days, that they would have wisdom and have something to say. But they didn't, is basically what he's saying. We see his conclusion in verse 9. Great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. He's saying days should teach wisdom, but that's not always the case. So that's quite a rebuke to these three. And he goes on and he speaks all the way through chapter 36. He speaks of the fact that God speaks. He speaks of the fact that God is just and that God is sovereign. Now, Elihu, though he had less days than the others, really was more advanced spiritually than the others. In other words, he made better use of his days. In Psalm 19, the context is set in verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth or manifests his handiworks. And then in verse 2 and 3, day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. So what he's saying there is, just as the heavens declare and show forth the glory of God, so do the days, day unto day, night unto night. There's no place where the voice of a day is not heard. He's saying one day speaks and shows forth the glory of God, and the next day does the same. And on it goes. It is day unto day, night unto night. The glory of God is declared. The glory of God is revealed. So in our text verses, both Elihu and David speak of days speaking, or days having a voice. Elihu says days should speak, and David says day unto day uttereth speech. In Job 32, we learn that our number of days should teach us In other words, our number of days should cause us to advance spiritually. But as Elihu learned, such is not always the case. In Psalm 19, we learn that days have a voice concerning the greatness of God. So we put these two together, and we see that the number of our days should cause an advancement in our knowledge, in our awareness of God's greatness. So our text verses are telling us that every day is a school. Every day is a school. It is a place, it is a time of learning and opportunity. It is a time of potential. So we're going to speak this morning on advancing in the school of today. Advancing in the school of today. One of the saddest things in life is an old fool. What a waste. What a waste. So I want to give just some general thoughts about our todays. Each one of us, our lives have consisted of a certain number of todays. And if we continue to live past today, we will have another today. And if past that, another today. It is day unto day. Eventually, the day unto day, Job 32:7, becomes a multitude of years. But you don't get to a multitude of years without day unto day. Day by day. Eventually, a multitude of years. So, however many days we have had, we have lived our life in those todays. And however many more todays we will have, we will live in those todays. In Genesis chapter 5, we have a genealogy. Throughout the genealogy, there is the phrase, all the days of. It's not all the years, it's all the days of. Now, it does speak of years as well, but it's the days that eventually become years. It is all the days of Adam. It is all the days of Seth, all the days of Enos, all the days of Canaan, all the days of Mahalalel, all the days of Jared, all the days of Enoch, all the days of Methuselah, all the days of Lamech. We see that in Genesis chapter 5. We hear David say in Psalm 27 verse 4, all the days of my life. Says it also in Psalm 23:6. All the days of my life. It's not all the years of my life, all the days of my life. We read in Isaiah 38:20 and Luke 1:75, all the days of our life. All the days. We will live all of our todays. You and I will live every single one of our todays. That is a truth that we must grasp. Another truth we must grasp is we live our lives in today. That's true every day. Oh, there may be those who are stuck in the past, but they live that way today. They don't live in the past. You can't do that. You can only live today. Now, you may be stuck in the past, but you live that way today. Others may be anxious about tomorrow, but you can't live in tomorrow. You can only live today. So if you're anxious about tomorrow, you live that way today. No matter how you and I live our lives, we can only do so today. We need to grasp that. We can only live today. I cannot live tomorrow until it becomes today. From Job chapter 14, the number of our todays have been predetermined by God. And we cannot pass that boundary. We cannot live beyond that number. And we will live all the days, all the todays that God has appointed us. And we will live all of those todays a certain way. Now, since I came from my mother's womb, this is my 24,658th today. Today becomes my 24th 658,000th today. And day unto day, each one of those todays, the heavens have declared and showed forth the glory of God. Every single one of those todays. 24,658 todays. And I have lived every one of them. I have lived every one of them. And however many days you have had, you have lived every single one of them. 24,658 days, and I have done something with every single one of them. So have you. We've done something. You say, well, it doesn't count when I was Elon's age. Oh, yes, it does. That's a today. It all counts. It all adds up. And we've done something with every single one of those todays. It was said of Isaac in Genesis 35:29 that he was old and full of days. The same thing was said of David. The same thing was said of Solomon. The same thing was said of Jehoiada. The same thing was said of Job. So if God so grants it, eventually you live enough todays that it can be said you are old and full of days. But what matters here is not so much full of days, but what fills our days. That's what matters. That's what matters. It's not so much the number of our todays, but what do we do with the number of our todays? If God so grant it, eventually you and I live enough todays that we can say with David in Psalm 37:25, I have been young and now am old. I have been young and now I am old. The truth is, today we're older than we were yesterday. And the truth is, we're younger than we will be tomorrow. In other words, today's the oldest you've ever been. It's also the youngest you'll ever be. Today. Again, 24,658 todays. And every single one of those todays is a gift from God. Only God can give you a today. No doctor can give you a today. Only God can give you a today. Every today is a gift. Every day I have had, 24,658 of them, have been filled with benefits from God. Every single one of them. We read in Psalm 68:19, "Blessed be the Lord who daily," that means every single today, "who daily loadeth us with benefits." 24,658 days of being blessed of God. 24,658 days of being daily loaded with benefits from God. Again, hear David say, "I have been young, and now am old." I don't believe he was complaining there. Don't dread old. Don't dread old. But thank God for all the todays that lead to old. Because they're all gifts from God. I don't believe God's pleased. Oh, I'm however old. We ought to thank God. Because there's been the gift of many todays leading to old. And old is relative. If you're 15, you think 30 is old. If you're 30, you think 50 is old. If you're 50, you think 70 is old. On and on it goes. You do eventually get to an age, you're old. I mean, that's all there is to it. There's just no denying it. I have been young and now I'm old. Old's not a horrible thing. Old's a blessed thing because of all the gifts of today's. And every one of those days have been filled with benefits from God. So the word today is a wonderful word. A word that speaks of the blessings of God. Every today declares and shows forth the glory of God. And every today I receive benefits from God. Therefore, every today is significant, and every today is meaningful. Oh, it's more significant than you and I know. And it's more meaningful than you and I know. The word today is a word that ought to fill us with anticipation. It is a word that ought to fill us with great joy and excitement. The Lord has given me another today. You look at all the gifts you've had in life, and I'm sorry, but no one has given you a gift like today. Today. So it ought to fill us with joy. It ought to fill us with excitement. It's a word of opportunity. With each and every today, you and I have opportunity. It's a word that ought to fill us with determination. I may have wasted yesterday, but God has given me another today. I don't have to waste it. He's given me another chance. Every today God gives us, He gives us another chance. We ought to View it with great gratitude and thanksgiving. So it's a blessed word today. The psalmist prayed in Psalm 90, verse 12, teach us to number our days. You know, he's talking about something more than counting them. Teach us to number our days, that in order that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. So this is twofold. There's the request. Teach, educate, instruct, train, guide, and enlighten us to number, to have a proper estimate of our days. There is the implication that there is a certain and correct judgment that needs to be formed concerning today. Concerning each today that we have. Teach us to number our days. It is a prayer to grasp the importance and the value of a today. How displeasing to God it must be for you and I to get up in the morning and say, oh, another day. Really? It's a gift. It's a gift from God. And then there's the reason for the request, that we may apply our hearts into wisdom. That we might live correctly. We've all lived a certain amount of todays. And we all have a certain amount of todays yet to live. And we need to examine our estimate, our view of a today. What does a today mean to us? We need to examine how we approach something as important as a today. We need to examine what we do with something as important as a today. If you and I that are saved are going to have lives for God, lives that are profitable, you know, I preached a lot of funerals. It's very difficult when you preach the funeral of someone who has wasted their life. We all have wasted todays, plenty of them. But I'm talking about someone who has wasted their life. It's sad. It's truly, truly sad. But if we are going to have todays that are worthwhile, meaningful, we must spend and use our todays correctly. So let's look at our todays. We've all lived a certain amount of todays. And that should challenge us, that should motivate us concerning our remaining todays. However many that might be. For you and I that are saved, we have lived a certain amount of todays as an unsafe person, and a certain amount of days as a saved person. Today is my 18,084th day since the Lord saved me. That means that my unsaved life consisted of 6,574 days. So I'm at the point where my saved days are 3 times the amount of my unsaved days. What a blessing. What a blessing. And though each one of those days, the unsaved days, each one of those todays was lived without Christ, was lived alienated from God, yet every one of those days, my unsaved days, was a gift from God. Was a gift of His mercy, His grace, His long-suffering. And here I am in my 18,084th day with Christ. So for you and I that are saved, we need to have a proper view of our todays. Every today is a school with many invaluable lessons and reminders. Day unto day uttereth speech, David said. Day unto day uttereth speech that God is sovereign. Day unto day uttereth speech that God is almighty, that God is wise. Day unto day uttereth speech that God is loving, and God is merciful. You know, you tell your children something 5 or 6 times, and then you finally say, how many times do I have to tell you? Well, 18,084 days, God's been telling me the same thing. Have we learned it yet? Have we learned it yet? Day unto day utter speech of the goodness of God. Day unto day utter speech of the faithfulness of God. Day unto day utter speech of the sufficiency and the abundance of God. Day unto day utter speech of our need of God. Day unto day utter speech of the frailty and the weakness of man. Day unto day utter speech of the passing of the temporal. And yet still there are those who still have not learned that lesson. They still haven't learned it. Day unto day utter speech of the shortness of life and the vanity of life lived apart from God. 18,084 days since the Lord saved me. And every one of those days, these lessons have been declared. So however many todays you have had, this has been so. So the question is, do we hear the speech of a today? Because every day speaks. The question is, how well have we learned the lessons of today? Have those lessons been transferred over to our way of living? That's why Elihu was so upset. These men have lived a good amount of days, and yet they displayed no wisdom. In all of my days since salvation, the lesson has been presented. Don't trust in yourself. Don't put confidence in man. Trust God. Every day. That lesson has been presented to me. And Elihu said, days should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. Therefore, with each today, we should be having less and less confidence in self, and more confidence in God. With each today, we should be trusting less and less in ourselves, and more in God. Every day since my salvation, there has been a lesson. Do not depend upon appearance, but depend upon God. And days should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. It's not always the case. There are the old fools. But we live in a time when age is looked at as a handicap, and only younger people are smart and intelligent. Don't be a fool. Don't be a fool. If you believe that, you will grow into an old fool. You need to look at those who are old, that live right, and you do well to listen. They know what century it is. You don't have to tell them. You do well to listen. Days should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. With each today, God should be more and more in our lives. Again, Elihu made this statement. Multitude of years, that's a lot of todays, should teach wisdom. Wisdom is to be in agreement with God. If you live your life in agreement with God, you're wise. And if you don't, you're a fool. It's as simple as that. Wisdom is to view matters through the lens of God. That's wisdom. You can't do better than that. The question is, has our days brought us spiritual wisdom? Today may be our last today. None of us know. For certain, many of us have lived more todays than we have left. And you may be younger than me or younger than someone else, and you still may have lived more days than you have left. None of us know. But we need to learn the lessons of our todays. In Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, the Israelites were guilty of sinful neglect and not taking due notice of God. They were guilty of forgetfulness of God's dealings with them. And they obstinately clave to the carnal. And the result was they did not enter into Canaan, which was God's best for them. They failed to enjoy God's best. In light of that, it is said 3 times, Hebrews 3:7, Hebrews 3:15, Hebrews 4:7. Today, if you will hear His voice, harden not your hearts. That's what those old Israelites did. Today, don't do that. You hear the voice of God, do not harden your heart. So with that statement, we are warned against the way the Israelites lived their lives. And we are exhorted to spend each day correctly, listening to God. Today, if you will hear His voice, harden not your hearts. Every today that I have lived, and every today that you have lived as a child of God, there has been the voice of the shepherd to lead us, to direct us, to guide us, to instruct us, to rebuke, to correct, to assure, to comfort. Every single day, there's been the voice of the shepherd. And how many times we have hardened our hearts to the voice of the shepherd. The writer of Hebrews is telling us, don't do that. Don't do that. And don't feel so guilty about it that you fail to listen to Him today. Today is a new day, a new opportunity to hear His voice. Every today that we have had, I'm speaking of saved individuals now, there is His precious Word, a table spread before us. Every today I've had since saved, God has spread a table before me. And on that table is bread from heaven for each one of us. And we're able to partake. So you think of all of our todays since salvation. In each of those todays, we have had the opportunity to draw near to God. You may have backslidden yesterday. You may have failed miserably yesterday. But when the clock struck midnight, a new today began, and you have a new opportunity to draw near to God. Every today has brought us that. And here we are today. How near to God am I? In our todays since salvation, we have had the opportunity to personally experience Him. And here we are today. Where are we in our experience of Him? In our todays, we have had the opportunity to live in the reality and the enjoyment of the blessings of salvation. To live in the reality of His love, His care, His grace, His mercy, His goodness. To live in the reality of His person. And here we are today. And how real are these things to us? Every today we have had the opportunity to live in His light, to live in His strength, His peace, and His victory. And here we are today. To what degree are these things in our life? You see, by honestly answering these questions, don't dishonestly answer them, because then you're lying to yourself. But honestly answering these questions, we see what we have done with our todays. We have had in our todays the opportunity to feed upon Him, to feed upon His Word. I have pastored individuals through the years who have sat in church all their life, members of a church, and know nothing. They don't know anything. They haven't learned a thing. Nothing. What a waste of todays. What a waste of todays. To what extent is our life marked by this book? In our today since salvation, we've had the privilege and opportunity to live separated unto Him. And here we are today. How set apart are we for Him? In all of our todays, we've had the opportunity to live committed and devoted to Him. You do that day unto day, guess what? Today you should be pretty committed and devoted to Him. In our todays since salvation, we've had the privilege and opportunity to praise Him, to thank Him, to worship Him, and here we are today. To what extent are our lives marked by these things? Every today we've had the opportunity to advance spiritually. And here we are today. Where are we? Where are we spiritually? It is God that gives us our today. And He is to be the purpose of our today. He's to be the object. He's to be the center. He's to be the highlight of our today. Our today is to be about Him. Again, we've all had a certain amount of todays. We've all have a certain amount of todays appointed to us. None of us know how many todays we have left. Well, I think I've got a lot left. I'm pretty healthy. Let me tell you something. Healthy people die every day. You don't have to be sick to die. You don't have to be sick to die. Healthy people die. You may be healthy. You ought to thank God for it. But don't take it for granted. Don't take that as a promise that you're going to live a long time. And though I do not know how many todays I have left, I do know that I do not have as many, in my case, I do know for certain that I don't have as many left as I've lived. That I know for certain. I'm not going to live up to 134. It's not going to happen. So I know for certain that I don't have as many todays left as I've had. That I know. Well, that's depressing. No, it isn't. It ought to be challenging. Notice in 1 Peter 4:2. 1 Peter 4, verse 2. That he should no longer live the rest of his time. The rest of his time. None of us know what's included in that. The rest of his time. But we ought to determine that the rest of my time, the rest of my todays, is not going to be in the flesh to the lust of men, but to the will of God. That ought to be our determination. I don't know how many todays I have left. Well, we ought to determine I'm not going to waste it in this world with the things of this world. I'm going to live to the will of God. And in closing, word to the unsaved. Every single one of us came into this world a sinner against God. In the bondage and imprisonment and the misery of sin. Guilty, condemned before God. Sinners without the righteousness that God requires. You might be able to look at a child and say, that's a good kid. We know what you mean. But in all their goodness, they're unacceptable before God. If unsaved, all your todays have been lived without Christ. Every single one of them. Without God. And under the guilt and condemnation of sin. However many days you have lived those todays not saved. Every single one of them. Not saved. And every single one of those todays, it has been a fact that Jesus saves. If unsaved, you've lived every single today unsaved. But every single today, it's been a fact that Jesus saves. And you've rejected Him. Day unto day. But God's been merciful in granting you day unto day. But know this. You are going to have your last today. It's coming. It's coming for all of us. Our last today. But I can stand here and tell you today that today Jesus saves. I can say that every today. So the unsaved sinner, realize that each day brings you closer to the time that you will stand before the Lord in your sins. Today means that it's not too late, but it's also a reminder too late is coming. Too late is coming. If you're alive today, it's not too late. But too late's coming. So the unsaved sinner needs to cry out to the Lord for the Lord to save their hell-deserving soul. May we not waste our todays. May we not complain about old age, because that simply means God has given us the gift of many todays. Examine your todays, because here's what we do. How we lived yesterday, we'll probably live today. You get in a cycle. You get in a pattern. You get in a terrible habit. There are times those habits need to be broken. The pattern needs to be broken. Don't waste today. God help us to realize the gift of today. Brother Ben, if you'd come and lead us in a verse of song.